Hello again. I've been playing some more Dwarf Fort, on a volcano, on an island, surrounded by goblins. Welcome to Guildstopped, a dwarf fortress in the universe of dragons. I've never actually played a volcano fortress. Hell, I've never even dabbled with magma in all my time playing Dwarf Fort. Because of the way I'd play it for many short stints over so many years, I just never got into it in much depth like I am now with the new and shiny version. So anyway, here we are, carrying a pretty standard caravan load including chickens and sheep, and burrowing a little way into the ground to set up our farms and workshops. I made our poor overworked expedition leader the manager and bookkeeper after building him a small office to work in, and set about producing the first few things we'd need to survive: barrels, booze, and things to drink out of. The first migrant wave to arrive was 6 more dwarves, a helpful boost to the productivity of the fort. But moving forward a little in time here, since I don't want to spend too much time talking about every little thing I did early on, I started playing with magma to try and set up some smelters and a forge. Again, I've never done anything with this, so I wasn't exactly sure how it needed to be set up, but in any case I got it working despite it not exactly looking optimal. And unusually for me, I had a barracks set up for everybody to sleep in for now, but wanted to start making bedrooms, so I started to plan out a large space to house our early migrants in, with larger than necessary bedrooms and extra spaces for nobles later on. The first to arrive should be rewarded for their faith in the in the fortress. A few seasons in now, the place is going well, though the population has yet to really grow much. We've traded with the mountain homes, and I'm sure on their return some more migrants will head our way. The food and drink needs of the population are well in hand by now, and we've got plenty of metals to start making arms and armour with just as soon as we've got some spare dwarves to make a squad from. And sure enough, we did get some more dwarves. For some reason I missed the alert for their arrival and only noticed later on once they dribbled in. They took the population up to 34, and as the population had grown, Zulban Rigger Throvod claimed a workshop and made Nomic Nissan, an andesite coffer. And shortly afterwards, just after planning another lair for a few early temples, Adil Nitigravod was possessed and claimed a leatherworks, which I had to build specifically for him, along with all the requisite shops to also provide said leather, as I presumed he'd need some of that too. Once everything was set up for him, he made a Malnish Tethush Fikod, a sheep leather buckler. This shield would become the subject of some intrigue later on, but for now it's just sitting around, displayed in the tavern. The population kept on growing, so I made another bedroom layer, designed for smaller bedrooms this time, but still containing some more luxurious suites for troublesome dwarves or nobles if I ended up with too many for my initial layer to handle. And of course it would be nice if this and the original bedroom layer could be symmetrical, but there's the whole volcano thing in the way of that. The first of many guilds formed, for farmers. I feel like that tends to be the first in most forts, which I suppose makes sense. And whilst I was building a hall for them into one of the points of the Star of Discord here, a Minotaur showed up. I'm not prepared for this, so I hastily set up a burrow and told everybody to hide indoors while I set up a squad and had some weapons made for them. Unfortunately, however, there was a migrant wave arriving at the same time. Luckily for the migrants, Logem Dodox Diggers was in their midst, a herbalist with a very particular set of skills, which apparently include beating Minotaurs half to death with their bare hands. Logem died a hero's death and set up the easiest Minotaur kill ever for the newly formed squad named the True Bells. I set up some tombs for the saviours of the fort. They're quite grand, because dwarves willing to show up here early on and kill a Minotaur for us should probably be respected in death. As is customary after an early threat it seems, we now had some goblin thieves to contend with, so I sent the bells after them to drive them off. Only one was caught, the others wisely kept running as their friend was decapitated by Iden Mistem Noram. And by this point the fortress is populous enough that they've elected a mayor, named Bim.
Hey, Bim!
Bim is obsessed with rings and constantly mandates their production whilst banning their export. This is pretty tame, to be honest. If they were banning the export of gems, then we'd be ruined and I'd have to find a fun way to deal with the problem. Aleth Erasarol claimed a workshop to create the incredible work known as Gem Bishes, an andesite bracelet with a funny name. And I had another caravan bug. Not like last time where the traders wouldn't leave. On this occasion, for some reason, they were unable to unload any goods. They just sat for a while, unable to trade, and then left disappointed that I didn't buy anything. Okay, fair enough. Moving on. Thanks for all the support everybody's shown lately. The channel is growing really fast and I appreciate everything you're doing. From supporting me directly through Patreon or just giving me your precious time to watch my content. I intend to do this stuff full time eventually, and I can only do that with you lovely people supporting me. That said, back to it. We're a few years into this fortress now and things are looking about right. Running late on military as usual though, probably wouldn't still be looking so great if it weren't for that one migrant wave containing a dwarven Chuck Norris. A barracks should probably be at the top of the to-do list here. Naturally then, the next thing I did was set up the mayor's quarters just so. We've got to keep Bim happy. And hey, remember Adil Nittigravod? Well, he went mad. Here he is crawling around the fortress babbling. I'm not exactly sure what sent him over the edge, but over the edge he most certainly went. He'll die of thirst pretty soon, but I'll leave him to crawl around to his heart's content until then. On the other hand, here's Mafol Bekaralon, the commander of the fort's militia, claiming a carpenter's shop. Whilst trying to satisfy his demands, I learned that a dwarf will gather materials in the same order they ask for them, which in this case helped me realise that he couldn't find any bones. Thankfully, that problem has a simple solution, which on this occasion is shaped like a sheep. He made an ashen chest named Fokash Masos, and I put it in his bedroom, because that just seemed like a nice thing to do. Oh, and there goes Adil. Anyway, since this fortress is going so well for everybody except for Adil, I'm starting to play with some of the features I've not really touched before. Right now, that means I'm setting up a dungeon, which requires a dungeon master. And as is my usual method, I hired the most qualified applicant, a random peasant named Edem Conerith. With the next wave of migrants, the fort's population runs past 100, so I should probably make a hospital and start making the various things it will need. And at about the same time as that, I set up a really unnecessarily long archery range for a squad of crossbow dwarves. I've never really been able to get rangers to work for me in Dwarf Fort. Usually I find they'll get a bolt or two off and then run in and start smacking, which does often work to be fair, but for the cost of not having a shield, it seems like it would be more valuable to just train extra melee fighters. Unless a forgotten beast with webs or something shows up. But that's not what showed up. Goblins did. Which makes sense considering we're surrounded by the things, but it's just a group of 6 or so ranged goblins. I found that throughout this whole fortress. When goblins showed up, they were all rangers, with the exception of the few goblin thieves that come alongside each group. Is this normal? I'm curious whether that's the usual experience. In any case, the goblins were all driven off or killed by the bells. Thanks to having bucklers, they didn't take too many hits and only 2 soldiers suffered minor wounds. However, despite my best efforts with a burrow, I couldn't convince the hunters to come back inside from their work. So the fort lost Uvash Othilcog and Zolban Fencegrowl. Iden Ritzigan, a miller, also took a shot to the kidney, but they'll recover. This was thanks to the farm being so close to the surface. It'd be smart to set up a proper farm underground, but spoiler alert, I won't. I hurriedly put together an area for manufacturing soap, as I'd forgotten to do that thus far, and now we've got wounded, it would probably be a good time. So after much worshipping, drinking, socializing and sleeping, the appointed doctors and surgeons did their jobs and sutured the wounded. A human caravan came a little bit later and I traded them a load of gems for the usual suspects: leather, cloth and cheese. I've been making basically the exact same trade with every caravan that's shown up so far. I do have milk-producing animals and could make my own cheese, and I've got plenty of my own cloth and leather too, but trade is good for relations, and I've got bins full of cut gems, so why not? Here's a rare sight: the archers actually using their archery range. I struggled for a long time to get them to carry ammunition in the previous patch, so it looks like some of that behaviour is being refined. Still though, I don't think I could really rely on this squad given the way I like to engage threats, which is to run at them before they make it anywhere near my civilian population. I put some fortifications on the roof over the stairway, but I still found that even when stationed up there, they'd just take a shot or two and then start swinging. I don't really know what to do with these guys. And at this point the original tomb that I made is full, so I had a layer mined out for some less nice but still very nice tombs, as further death is of course inevitable. There have been quite a few strange moods between the last one I mentioned and now, but I don't think it's worth spending the time reciting the details of every last one. However, it is worth noting that the last two, Umarlek and Thismoma's Thebeses, are both cages, the former of wood and the latter of moonstone. I'm not sure what kind of things the dwarves are talking about in the tavern, but if their creations are any indication, it's getting a bit weird. You know what else is weird? Hydras. Here's one now to have a look at. Thram Smemawakueguthra, with its 7 biting heads. So this could be tough. The squads were both stationed up at the entrance, and I was hoping the archers would be able to get some shots in from the roof, but they didn't. The Hydra slipped in through this corner of the wall that never got filled in and started fighting in melee, pretty much immediately biting off Rakust's leg. He's the captain of the ranged squad, which is lucky because you only need one leg to shoot a crossbow. You probably don't even need any legs to shoot a crossbow, but anyway, the Hydra was catching quite a few bolts whilst in combat with the bells, which were helping, but the majority of the work was being done in melee. Stabbing, slashing, bashing, and of course, it wouldn't be dwarf combat without a little biting. One particularly angry spear dwarf bit one of its faces while it was going down. And go down it did. I find that my swords dwarves all follow the tactic of wounding arms and legs to put something on the ground, and then it's just a free-for-all after that. That's what happened to the poor Hydra here. The only injuries on our side were Rakust getting his leg bit off, and another one of the rangers, Odom Ubalgisim, who had a bit of his liver removed. That doesn't seem like bad going for a Hydra. And after all that excitement, I decided to lay out another floor for some larger temples, so that I can designate more grand spaces to the most attended religions. I don't really know, this is another of those mechanics I'm not enormously familiar with. Dwarves follow multiple religions to varying degrees, and later on you can formally recognize a religion and appoint priests, which is valuable as they can console upset citizens in the same way as a mayor. But I think that's only something you can do when asked to by the dwarves. The goblins were clearly terrified of my religious devotion at this point, since they showed up intending to siege the fortress and then immediately turned away. Perhaps they just thought it wasn't worth it after all. It's a little bit odd, but alright. It's time to expand the farms a bit, because we're low on drink. A little bit later on I figured out that we're actually not struggling due to a lack of ingredients, but rather brewers. But I'll get to that later. For now, I guess we just grow more mushrooms. Ral Mostibiteb claimed a crafts shop and made Ush Dishkoman, a walnut ring, which I put on a pedestal in the mayor's dining room since he loves rings so much. And now I've realised I need more brewers, so I make a few extra stills and set up 5 dedicated brewers, as well as making sure to ramp up barrel production. But I don't want to have to get more wood, so what do we have a load of spare? Ah yes, lead barrels. That'll do nicely. The reason drink stocks were spiralling down in the first place is because the population has been steadily growing, up to 165 with the last wave of migrants. Despite not actually having any fishable water on the map, the Fishery Workers Guild wanted a guild hall, so I made them one, shaped like a fish. Very good. In response to my fun little distraction, a bush titan made of amber showed up. It's described as a web shooter, which can be extremely dangerous, but it was actually fine for the most part. I still couldn't really get the ranged squad to do much as it came in, but once it was in melee it died pretty quickly. It did, however, take its toll. Poor Bim's head was exploded by a swift kick from the titan. Hey Bim, guess what? You're dead. Ilral Moralmeng was also killed in this combat, just not in a funny way. 2 others were injured, Zuglar and Moffel, the militia commander, who were waiting in the hospital for diagnosis, but they're not seriously injured. This was followed near immediately by another goblin siege, composed of about 10 goblins. Once again, all ranged. In a moment of stupidity, I sent the ranged squad out to them first, somehow figuring that ranged versus ranged made sense. What I forgot is that the ranger squad doesn't actually have any armor, so as a result they were shot up pretty bad before the bells swooped in and started slicing away. Zassit Odom Sigon, one of the Swords Dwarves, went full-on sicko mode and personally killed 6 of the goblins in a martial trance. Once again, I like ranged dwarves much more in theory than practice, though it's probably the way I use them that's the problem. It would likely make much more sense to set up scenarios where I can have them fire on trapped enemies rather than expect them to work in an open battlefield as I often do. I should probably make a second melee squad in any case. And more tombs too. That being said, no one actually died in this engagement. The most wounded was Cog Kagith Sodel, who suffered numerous pretty terrible injuries, one considerably more terrible than the rest, and he's very slow to heal, so he'll be struggling with these injuries for a very, very long time too. Catan Tithalurist decided to try and bring the mood up a bit by making a sleek giant cave spider silk hood named Thickthog Bembul. I misread this at first as being a giant hood made of cave spider silk as opposed to a hood of giant cave spider silk. Either way, that's cool. For some reason it has an image of 2 puffins on it. And now it's time for that totally random peasant I made a dungeon master to earn their place. Because Amalnish Tethosh Fikod, that leather shield made by the notorious lunatic Adil Nitigrivod that's been sitting in the tavern for a few years, has been nicked. 6 witnesses are accusing Olon Azothingis of the crime, so an interview was scheduled to get to the truth of the matter.
Interview by Superintendent Hastings, D.I. Fleming, D.I. Arno. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court.
Olon revealed that he was corrupted by a poet named Aslot Spidery Steel in order to take the artifact away on his behalf. Very interesting. But Aslot isn't here anymore, so there's not much I can do about that, other than to put Olon in a cage and have him think very hard about what he's done. By now, the fort has exhausted the reserves of iron that were built up during our excavations of the levels thus far occupied. So in order to effectively sniff out some more, I learned some geology. It turns out I'd be most likely to find iron in sedimentary rock layers. Unfortunately, as we're on a volcano, we have igneous extrusive layers instead. I spent quite some time trying to precisely strip mine areas that would be more likely to contain magnetite. Anyway, basically I didn't find any, but I did start to find some more valuable gems and other ores like bismuthine and sphalerite, which would let me make some more fun and interesting alloys like brass and bismuth bronze, which serve to increase the value gained per ore when smelting. The end result is that I'll be using silver to make maces and warhammers to save my iron for armour. The mountain homes must have gotten wind of my advanced dwarfing because when they visited next, the realm was elevated to a barony, meaning the mayor would now hold the title of baron and that smaller settlements could appear and act under my economic umbrella. This sort of thing is well above my Dwarf Fortress pay grade and I have only the vaguest understanding of it all, but it's nice to be recognised either way. Sure enough, the hillocks of Tombdrum were founded a day's travel from Guildstopt and incorporated into our holdings. Cool, I think. I've had these squads training and fighting long enough now that they're starting to get attached and naming their equipment. Starting with Fikod Shuzrathkel, who named their crossbow Zoznoglesh, which as far as I know doesn't do anything functionally, but it's neat. Up on the surface, the dwarven caravan that brought news of our barony was still sitting in the depot after having performed the usual trade, when a giant arrived. Samam Rirazlimul Lissig Athir. I let him come and get personal with the caravan's guards before sending in the bells to help take it down. We're closing in on 5 years into this story now, and things are going very smoothly. The fort's population is approaching its cap of 200, and I think they're largely very happy to be here. We've so far not let any outsiders into the tavern, which I think has lowered the likelihood of encountering any werebeasts or vampires. This, on the one hand, allows for a more stable fort, but it can also make things a bit dull at times. The random monsters and sieges are trying their best, but they've been pretty impotent thus far. Here's another one now. A siege of less than 10 goblins which was driven off by the fort's military. As was another giant. A giantess actually this time. And she wasn't really driven off by the military, but rather just by Iden Mistemnaram, who stabbed through each of her hands before cutting her legs to shreds. The logs actually make for a pretty tragic read, but then she did come here looking for a fight, so it's hard to feel too sympathetic. Here's where we finally excavated into some caverns, thanks to the search for deeper ores and general shiny things. Naturally, this was followed by a flood of monster slayers petitioning to stay at the fort, which for now I turned down, because I wanted to build them a dedicated cavern tavern right by the entrance to the caverns, rather than have them hanging around in the main body of the fortress. And shortly after finding the cavern, we spotted the Great Magma Sea, with a little bit of Adamantine visible too. Very inviting. Naturally, like the greedy little dwarf I am, I started trying to dig a path to the Adamantine, and found lots of very shiny gems in the process. But trying to navigate the magma pools down here proved rather difficult, and I soon gave up for now, and focused on building a library instead. This is yet another of those features I've had very little contact with. Dwarves can either be scholars who ponder topics and write manuals on their areas of expertise, or scribes who make copies of the scholars' works, increasing the accessibility of this knowledge to the rest of the fort's inhabitants. My scholarly efforts were interrupted by yet more goblins. About 20 of them this time, including the thieves. But once again, they're all using ranged weapons, so I sent the 2 melee squads out to obliterate them, which they did. The captain of the more recently formed Reputations of Gold, a squad primarily using blunt weapons, decided that after smashing a goblin's body to pieces with his silver warhammer, it was more worthwhile to strangle it to death on the ground than try and break through its helmet. Fair enough, Reg. You're the Hammer Dwarf, not me. You know best. And naturally, now that we've finally broken into the caverns, we'll start to see forgotten beasts bubbling up from their murky depths. Starting with Athrig's lusty slim, Osmos, a great quadruped of steam whose knobbly trunk undulates rhythmically. They undulated rhythmically out of sight to be killed by a troll or something, I guess, because I never saw it again. But 5 minutes later, its friend Lathi Relimikova appeared. A huge skinless llama with a short trunk that shoots fire, which is an interesting visual, but fire generally isn't that dangerous in Dwarf Fortress. So long as your combatants are wearing some armour, they're usually fine. Zassit Odom Sigun was first on the scene and started by lopping that little trunk off before going into the old cut-to-shreds routine. It did smash in a child's head before he got there, but that's not necessarily the worst thing for the fortress. After this, the dwarves from the mountain homes arrived once again to grant further status to the lands. We're now a county. Very nice. And by this point the fortress is rich and runs itself near autonomously. Through the year 105, they successfully defended another 2 sieges and about 6 more forgotten beasts of varying threat levels. So perhaps it's best to let the tale of Guildstopt fade into the doldrums of monotonous bureaucracy. Oh shit, a forgotten beast with webs just killed the entire military. Alright everyone, say your prayers and grab some booze. It's time to give this place back to the Volcano and seal our mistakes away in magma. Whatever you do, remain indoors. Sure, it's slowly filling up with volcanic magma, but drinking yourself silly awaiting a fiery end still beats what's going on out there. Thanks once again for all the support. And until next time, goodbye.